Welcome. This is Calm Art Studio. In this episode, we begin the story of Claude Monet at the very start of his life, before the gardens, before the water lilies, before the name Impressionism had any meaning at all. We'll move slowly through Monet's early years, the places that shaped him, the light he grew up with, and the quiet ways he learned to see the world. This is not a story of sudden brilliance or early certainty, but of gradual attention, of observation, of a way of looking that formed over time. You don't need to watch closely. You can let the images drift by or simply listen. This video is designed for rest, for reflection, or for sleep, to be experienced at whatever pace feels right for you. If you find these calm art histories helpful, you're very welcome to like and subscribe, and join us for future episodes. And if you feel like it, you can share in the comments where you're listening from tonight. It's always quietly grounding to know how far these stories travel. Now, let's begin with the early light that shaped Claude Monet, and the first moments of a way of seeing that would change painting forever. Claude Monet was born on the 14th of November, 1840, in Paris. It was a city day, an indoor day, the kind marked by time and documentation rather than weather. The rooms where he entered the world were likely lit by lamps or filtered daylight through windows that looked onto streets, onto stone buildings, onto the enclosed and ordered spaces of urban life. But Paris was not where he would learn to see. When he was around 5 years old, his family moved to Le Havre, a port city on the northern coast of France. Le Havre sat at the mouth of the Seine, where the river opened into the English Channel. It was a place shaped by commerce and tide, by ships arriving and departing, by fog rolling in from the water and lifting slowly under morning sun. The harbor was always present. From many parts of the town, you could see masts rising against the sky. You could hear the sound of rigging, the distant calls of workers loading cargo, the low horns of vessels moving through mist. The air smelled of salt and coal smoke. It was not the smoke of factories alone, but the smoke of steamships, of engines that moved across water. The smell was constant, part of the atmosphere, woven into the fabric of daily life. On some days, it was heavier, when the wind came from certain directions, carrying the scent of burning coal across the waterfront. On other days, it was lighter, mixed with salt air and the smell of wet rope and timber. Le Havre was neither fully rural nor fully urban. It was a working port. There were streets and buildings, markets and schools, but always the presence of the sea, the weather arriving from open water. Fog came often. Sometimes it settled so thickly that the harbor disappeared entirely. You could stand at the waterfront and see nothing beyond a few meters, just gray upon gray, shapes dissolving into atmosphere. Other times it hung in layers, revealing some things and obscuring others, so that a ship's hull might be clear while its sails dissolved into gray. The masts would appear and disappear. A building across the harbor might be visible one moment and gone the next, not because it had moved, but because the air between had changed. This was the light Monet grew up in. It was not the light of fields or forests. It was not the light of a city square or a cathedral interior. It was coastal light, changeable, softened by moisture, shaped by wind and cloud. In Le Havre, the sky and the water were always in conversation. The line between them was not always certain. At dawn and dusk, the horizon could vanish entirely, leaving only gradations of color, shifts in tone too subtle to name, but impossible to ignore. You could stand and watch the sky change, minute by minute, the colors deepening or fading, the clouds moving through different densities of light, the water below reflecting or absorbing what came from above. Monet lived in this place during the years when a child begins to notice the world. He walked streets that led to the waterfront. He saw men working on docks, ships being loaded, cargo moving in and out of warehouses. He saw the way fog moved through a harbor, how it could make something nearby seem distant, how it could turn the familiar into something quiet and strange. He must have watched this many times. The ordinary process of fog arriving, settling, lifting. The way it changed everything without changing anything. The same buildings and ships and streets becoming unfamiliar simply because of what the air was doing. He attended a secondary school in Le Havre. Later, looking back, he would describe himself as unruly from birth. He said that school felt like a prison to him. The structure, the schedules, the requirement to sit still and attend to lessons that seemed disconnected from the world outside the classroom windows. And yet, school records also noted that he had an excellent manner with his classmates. There was a contradiction there, or perhaps just the ordinary tension of a young person who did not yet know what he was looking for, only that it was not found in the structure of lessons and schedules. He was restless, but he was also observant, and he began to draw. At first, he drew caricatures. These were not careful studies. They were quick, exaggerated portraits of townspeople and teachers, drawings that captured something recognizable, something sharp, in just a few lines. He had a talent for it. He could see what made a face distinct, what gesture or expression defined a person, and he could set it down on paper with charcoal, simply and clearly. The drawings were confident. They had the quality of something done without hesitation, without excessive deliberation. He saw and he drew, and the result captured something essential. People noticed. Shopkeepers began displaying his caricatures in their windows. People walking through town would pause and recognize the faces. They would point and laugh, not unkindly, but with the pleasure of seeing someone they knew rendered in this bold, playful way. Monet, still a boy, became a small local celebrity. His portraits appeared in the street. People knew his work. They would walk past a shop and see a face they recognized, drawn with just enough exaggeration to be humorous, but not cruel. And they would know it was the work of the Monet boy, the one who could capture you in a few strokes of charcoal. He sold them. 10 francs, sometimes 20. It was not a fortune, but it was something. It was recognition. It was proof that what he could do with his hands had value, that others would pay to own it, that they would display it, show it to their friends, take pleasure in it. This was his first experience of being seen as an artist. It was a modest fame, limited to the town, the kind of recognition that might fade as quickly as it arrived. But it mattered. It placed him in a role. It gave him a reason to keep looking, to keep noticing, to keep translating what he saw into marks on paper. It gave him the experience of being known for something he made, for a skill that was particular to him, that others did not have or had not developed in the same way. During these years, Le Havre continued around him. The harbor did not change, but the light did, constantly. Mornings were different from afternoons. The early morning light, when the sun was still low, came across the water at a shallow angle, turning the harbor into a sequence of long shadows and bright reflections. By midday, the light was higher, more even, less dramatic. And in the afternoons, as the sun moved toward the western horizon, the light changed again, becoming warmer, more golden, creating different shadows, different patterns on the water. Winter light was different from summer light. In winter, the sun stayed low all day, and the light had a certain coolness to it, a clarity that made distances seem greater. In summer, the light was warmer, softer, and the days were longer, so that the harbor remained visible well into evening, the light fading gradually through shades of blue and violet before darkness finally arrived. The same view could look entirely new, depending on the hour, the season, the weather moving in from the channel. Monet was learning something, though he may not have known it yet. He was learning that seeing was not simple, that the world did not hold still, that what you saw depended on when you looked and how you looked and what you were willing to notice. The harbor was always there, but it was never the same. The ships changed, of course, different vessels arriving and departing. But even if the ships had been identical, even if nothing had moved, the light would have made it different. The light was always moving. The caricatures were about people. They were about character, personality, the lines of a face. But the place where he lived was teaching him something else. It was teaching him about atmosphere, about change, about the way light could make the same scene unrecognizable from one moment to the next. Le Havre was not a picturesque town. It was not built to be painted. It was functional, industrial, practical. The harbor served commerce, not beauty. The buildings were made for work, for storage, for the practical needs of a port city. And yet it had its own beauty. The beauty of working places, of honest weather, of light that did not perform but simply existed, shifting, repeating, never quite the same. The fog that came in from the channel was not there to create a mood or an effect. It was simply what happened when moist air moved over cooler water, when conditions aligned in a particular way. It came because the weather brought it. And it changed everything it touched, not through intention, but through its presence. The way it filtered light, the way it softened edges, the way it made near things distant and familiar things strange. Monet walked through this fog many times as a boy. He must have experienced it in all its variations. The thick fogs that made it difficult to see more than a few steps ahead. The lighter fogs that created a kind of veil, softening everything without hiding it completely. The fogs that came in layers, so that you could see clearly at ground level, but the upper parts of buildings disappeared into gray. The fogs that lifted slowly as morning progressed, revealing the harbor bit by bit, the way a curtain might be raised gradually in a theater. This was part of his daily experience. The weather that shaped Le Havre, the constant presence of moisture in the air, the way the sea and the sky worked together to create conditions that were never entirely predictable, never entirely stable. Around 1856 or 1857, when Monet was 15 or 16, something happened that would change the direction of his life. He met a man named Eugène Boudon. Boudon was a painter. He was older than Monet, not famous, but working steadily, painting the coast, the beaches, the skies above Normandy. He was a quiet man, serious about his work, devoted to a particular way of seeing that was not yet common or widely understood. He painted outdoors. This was not yet common practice. Most painters worked in studios, building their compositions from sketches and memory. They would go outside to draw, to gather information, but the actual painting, the application of oil paint to canvas, happened indoors, in controlled conditions, where the light was steady and the weather could not interfere. But Boudon took his easel and his paints to the beaches near Le Havre, and worked directly from what he saw. He painted the sea. He painted clouds. He painted the people who came to the coast, the small figures walking along the sand, the tourists and locals who gathered at the water's edge. But more than anything, he painted the sky. Boudin believed that the sky was the key to landscape, that it set the tone, the mood, the light of everything below it. He would say later that you had to begin with the sky, that everything else followed from it. The color of the sand was determined by the color of the sky. The appearance of the water was determined by what the sky was doing. You could not paint a landscape truthfully without first understanding the sky, without capturing its particular quality in that moment. And he painted skies endlessly, studying the way clouds formed and moved, the way light passed through them, the way they changed from morning to evening, from one season to another. He painted the same stretch of coast over and over, but the sky was always different, and so the paintings were always different. Each one a record of a particular moment, a particular arrangement of light and cloud and air. Monet met him on the beaches near Le Havre. It is not clear exactly how the meeting happened. Perhaps Boudin saw Monet's caricatures in a shop window and was impressed by the skill, the eye, the confidence of the drawings. Perhaps they simply encountered each other by chance. Two people drawn to the same stretch of coast, one painting and one walking. However it began, Boudin saw something in the younger man. He saw the skill, the eye, the restlessness. And he made an offer. He invited Monet to come paint with him outdoors. Monet was reluctant at first. He was still focused on his caricatures, still thinking of art as something done indoors, something quick and defined. The caricatures had brought him recognition, had given him a way of being seen, of being valued. They were successful in their modest way. And painting outdoors, working with oil paint in the open air, seemed strange, difficult, perhaps unnecessary. Why not work in a studio, where conditions were controlled, where you could take your time, where the light did not change every few minutes? But Boudin was persistent. He encouraged him. He spoke about what he had learned from working outdoors, about the freshness and immediacy it brought to the work, about the way it forced you to see truly, to respond to what was actually in front of you, rather than what you thought should be there. And eventually, Monet agreed. Boudin brought him to the beaches, set up easels side by side, and showed him how to work in oil paint, how to look at a landscape not as a fixed thing, but as a series of relationships, of light and shadow, of color and tone, all shifting together. This was Monet's first experience of plein air painting, of standing outside with a canvas, trying to capture not just the shapes of things, but the feeling of them, the atmosphere, the particular quality of a moment that would be gone in an hour. It was difficult. The light moved. The sun crossed the sky, and the shadows changed, and the colors shifted. And what had looked right 5 minutes ago no longer looked right now. The wind disturbed the canvas, made it hard to work steadily, blew sand into the wet paint. Colors that looked right in the studio looked wrong outdoors, too bright or too dull, too warm or too cool. The relationships between colors were different in natural light. You had to mix differently, think differently, see differently. The act of painting outside required a different kind of attention, a different kind of speed. You could not deliberate endlessly. You could not step back and consider for long periods. The moment was passing. The light was changing. You had to respond. You had to trust your eye and your hand, and accept that what you made would be incomplete, a record of an instant, rather than a finished statement. Budan taught him this, not through lectures or lessons, but by example, by returning to the same places again and again, by showing him that painting was not about capturing a scene once and perfectly, but about looking over and over, learning to see what was actually there, rather than what you expected to see. They painted together for different seasons, through the changing weather of the Normandy coast, through days of clear sun and days of heavy cloud, through mornings when the light was cool and sharp, and afternoons when it was warm and diffuse, through the endless variations of sky and water and atmosphere that Budan studied with such devotion. Monet watched him work. He saw how Budan approached the sky, how he mixed his colors to capture the particular blue or gray or violet of a given moment. He saw how Budan worked quickly but not carelessly, how he made decisions rapidly but with purpose, how he built up the surface of the painting through many small strokes, each one contributing to the overall impression without calling attention to itself. And he began to understand something. He began to understand that painting was not about rendering objects accurately. It was about capturing a feeling, an atmosphere, a quality of light. It was about responding to the world as it appeared in a particular moment, under particular conditions, and accepting that the next moment would be different, that the work you were doing was not permanent or final, but provisional, a record of seeing, an attempt to hold something that was always moving. This was a different way of thinking about art. It was not about constructing an ideal image. It was not about perfection or finish. It was about observation, attention, the willingness to stand in the weather and look, really look, at what was happening in the air, in the light, on the surface of the water. Monet would remember Budan for the rest of his life. He would say that Budan was the one who taught him to see, that it was on those beaches, in that coastal light, that he began to understand what painting could be. The harbor, the fog, the changing skies, the long hours standing on sand, watching the light shift. The patience required to wait for the right moment, and the speed required to catch it before it passed. All of this entered him during those years. He was still very young. He had not yet gone to Paris as a serious student. He had not yet met the other painters who would become his colleagues and friends. But something had begun. Something had opened. He had learned that the world was not static. That light was not decoration, but the substance of seeing. That to paint was to engage in a kind of patient observation, a willingness to return and return and return, to look again, even when you thought you had already looked. Le Havre, with its mists and its harbor traffic, with its coal smoke and its salt air, had given him this. And Budan, with his quiet persistence, his belief in painting outdoors, his devotion to the sky, had shown him that there was a way to approach it. Over time, Monet would leave Le Havre. He would go to Paris. He would study. He would struggle. He would meet other painters and begin to find his own path. But the foundation had been laid here, on these beaches, in this light, during these formative years. The caricatures had given him confidence, had taught him to see faces, to capture character quickly and surely. But Budan had given him something else. Budan had given him a way of looking at the world that was slower, more patient, more attentive to qualities that could not be captured in a few quick strokes. The fog, the sky, the changing light, These things required time. They required returning. They required a willingness to stand in the same place over and over and see it differently each time. This lesson would stay with him. It would shape everything he did afterward. It would be the foundation of his entire approach to painting, the core principle that guided him through decades of work. But in those early years, on the beaches near Le Havre, with Boudin beside him, setting up easels in the sand, mixing paint in the open air, it was simply something new. A different way of working. A different kind of attention. A door opening onto a possibility he had not previously imagined. Before he left for Paris to pursue formal study, Monet spent time at a place called the Académie Suisse, the Swiss Academy. It was not an academy in the traditional sense. It had no rigid curriculum, no official instructors, no examinations or prizes. It was simply a space where young artists could work from live models, without the heavy structure of the École des Beaux-Arts, France's official school of fine art. The École was powerful, prestigious, and difficult to enter. It had strict entrance requirements. It taught according to classical principles that had been refined over centuries. Students at the École learned to draw from plaster casts of ancient sculptures before they were allowed to draw from live models. They learned to build compositions according to established rules. They learned that certain subjects were worthy of serious art and certain subjects were not. History painting, religious subjects, mythological scenes, these were the highest forms of art. Landscape, still life, scenes from ordinary life, these were considered lesser, suitable for decoration, but not for serious artistic ambition. The Académie Suisse offered an alternative. It was informal. You paid a small fee, and in return, you had access to a room and a model. You could draw or paint as you wished. There were no teachers standing over you, correcting your technique, insisting on a particular approach. It was a place for artists who wanted to work seriously, but who were not yet ready for, or not interested in, the official path. Monet went there. He drew from the model. He practiced. He watched other young artists working, seeing how they approached the figure, how they handled light and shadow, how they made decisions about line and form. It was a different kind of education. Quieter, more self-directed. It required you to know what you were looking for, or at least to be willing to search for it without guidance. The Académie Suisse did not tell you what to paint or how to paint it. It simply gave you the space and the model, and left you to figure out the rest. This suited Monet. He was not someone who thrived under rigid instruction. He needed room to experiment, to fail, to try again. The Académie Suisse gave him that. It allowed him to develop his eye without someone constantly telling him what his eye should see. During this time, he was still learning, still uncertain, still finding his way between the quick, confident work of the caricatures and the slower, more demanding work of painting from life. But he was moving toward something. He was beginning to understand that painting was not about one brilliant insight, but about sustained attention, about the willingness to keep working, even when the work was difficult and the results were uncertain. The model would sit or stand in a pose for a period of time. The artists would arrange themselves around the room, each finding an angle, a viewpoint. And they would draw or paint, working in silence or in quiet conversation, each engaged with the problem of translating what they saw into marks on paper or canvas. It was repetitive work. The same basic task, over and over. But each time was different. Each pose was different. Each artist saw differently. And the challenge was always the same. How do you capture not just the form, but the presence of a living person? How do you make the drawing feel alive, feel inhabited, feel like more than just an arrangement of shapes? Monet worked at this. He drew many figures during his time at the Académie Suisse. He was building skills, training his hand to respond to his eye, learning to see proportions, to understand how weight and balance worked in the human body, to capture the subtle shifts of light and shadow that defined form. These were fundamental skills. They were the basis of all painting. And the Académie Suisse, with its informal structure, allowed him to develop them at his own pace, without the pressure of examinations or the requirement to work in a particular style. In 1862, Monet entered the studio of a painter named Charles Gleyre. Gleyre ran a teaching studio in Paris, one of several, where young artists could study under the guidance of an established painter. It was more structured than the Académie Suisse, but still relatively open. Gleyre charged a modest fee and allowed his students considerable freedom. Gleyre himself was a respected painter, accomplished in the academic tradition, but he was not rigid or doctrinaire. He understood that young artists needed space to develop, that they could not all be forced into the same mold. He offered guidance when asked, but he did not insist that his students paint exactly as he did. This was where Monet met three other young painters, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Frédéric Bazille, and Alfred Sisley. These four men would become close. They would paint together, argue together, support each other through years of struggle and rejection. They were all young, all serious about painting, all dissatisfied with the academic tradition that dominated French art at the time. In Gleyre's studio, they were expected to learn the fundamentals, to draw carefully, to build compositions according to classical principles, to paint historical or mythological subjects with precision and finish. This was the path to success in the official art world. It was the way to gain admission to the Salon, the annual exhibition where reputations were made and careers were launched. The Salon was everything. It was the primary way that painters became known, that they sold their work, that they built careers. To be accepted by the Salon meant that your work was seen by thousands of people, reviewed by critics, considered by collectors. To be rejected meant obscurity, poverty, the sense that your work did not matter, that you were working in isolation, disconnected from the wider world of art. But Monet and his friends were not interested in the path the Salon required. They were interested in something else. They wanted to paint the world around them, the contemporary world, the light and weather and ordinary life that official art ignored. They wanted to work quickly, to capture impressions rather than construct monuments. They wanted to paint outdoors, to respond to what they saw rather than what they had been taught to see. Together, they began to experiment. They used broken color, placing strokes of pure pigment side by side, rather than blending them smoothly on the palette. The eye, they discovered, would mix the colors when viewing the painting from a distance, creating an effect that was more vibrant, more luminous than traditional blending could achieve. They worked with rapid brushstrokes, building surfaces that were textured and alive, rather than smooth and finished. The brushstrokes were visible, evident, part of the experience of looking at the painting. This was considered crude by academic standards, a lack of finish, a failure to complete the work properly. But for Monet and his friends, the visible brushstrokes were essential. They were part of the honesty of the work, the acknowledgement that this was paint on canvas, not an illusion of reality, but a response to reality, a record of seeing. They painted landscapes, street scenes, rivers, gardens, all the subjects that the academic tradition considered minor or unworthy. They painted ordinary people doing ordinary things. They painted weather, light, atmosphere. They painted what interested them, what moved them, what they saw when they walked through the world with open eyes. They were laying the foundations for what would later be called Impressionism, though the name did not exist yet, and they did not think of themselves as part of a movement. They were simply trying to find a way to paint that felt true to their own experience, their own way of seeing. Glaire's studio gave them a place to meet. It gave them a shared context, a common language, even if what they did with that language was to break it apart and rebuild it in new ways. The friendships they formed there would sustain them for years. They would paint together, exhibit together, endure rejection and poverty together. They would encourage each other to keep going when it seemed impossible. But all of that was still ahead. In the early 1860s, they were just beginning. They were students, uncertain and hopeful, trying to learn what painting could be. They would leave the studio and go into the countryside around Paris, to the forest of Fontainebleau, where the light came through trees in dappled patterns, where paths wound through ancient woods, where you could set up an easel and work in quiet away from the city, to the banks of the Seine, where the river moved slowly through green fields, where boats passed, where the light on the water changed from hour to hour. They painted side by side. They compared their work. They discussed what they were trying to do, what was working, what was not. They learned from each other. Renoir might see something in the way Monet handled light. Monet might see something in the way Bazille arranged a composition. Sisley might point out a color relationship that the others had missed. This exchange, this shared exploration, was as important as any formal instruction. They were teaching themselves and each other, through practice, through experiment, through the daily work of trying to solve problems that had no clear solutions. Monet, at this point, was still carrying Le Havre with him. The lessons he had learned on the beaches with Boudin. The habit of looking at light, at weather, at the way a scene changed from one moment to the next. The knowledge that painting was not about freezing a moment, but about capturing the feeling of it, the atmosphere, the quality of the air, and the light. He brought this with him to Paris, to the Académie Suisse, to Glaire's studio, to his friendships with Renoir, Bazille, and Sisley. It was the foundation he built on, the instinct that guided him even when he was surrounded by other painters, other ideas, other ways of working. He talked about Boudin with his friends. He described the experience of painting outdoors, of trying to capture the sky, of learning to see the way light changed everything. And his friends listened. They were interested. They wanted to try it themselves, and so they did. They took their easels outdoors. They worked from nature. They tried to paint what they saw, directly and honestly, without the mediation of studio conventions, without the requirement to idealize or improve or construct according to classical rules. It was difficult work. The conditions were challenging. The light changed. The weather was unpredictable. It was hard to carry all the materials you needed. It was hard to find good locations. It was hard to work quickly enough to capture a moment before it passed. But it was also exhilarating. There was something immediate and alive about working outdoors that studio work could not match. You were present with your subject. You were responding in real time. The painting became a record of an encounter, a meeting between the painter and the world at a particular moment, under particular conditions. During these years, Monet was not yet the painter he would become. He was still learning, still struggling with technique, with color, with the enormous difficulty of translating what he saw onto canvas. He had not yet painted the works that would define his career. He had not yet found his own voice, fully and clearly. But he was moving toward it. He was spending long hours looking. He was painting and repainting, trying to understand how light worked, how color changed depending on its surroundings, how the eye perceived not isolated objects, but relationships, the way one tone affected another, the way everything shifted together. He was learning patience. The patience to stand in front of a subject and look at it not for minutes, but for hours, for days, returning again and again, seeing it in different light, different weather, different seasons. The patience to accept that most of what he painted would be imperfect, incomplete, a step toward understanding rather than a final statement. This patience was not natural to him. He was restless by nature, unruly, someone who chafed against structure and routine. As a boy, he had felt that school was a prison. He did not like being told what to do, how to behave, what to pay attention to. But painting demanded something from him. It demanded that he slow down, that he stay with something long enough to really see it, that he allow himself to fail and keep working anyway. Boudin had shown him this. The beaches of Le Havre had taught him this. And now, in Paris, working alongside other young painters, he was continuing to learn it. The city was different from the coast. The light was different. The subjects were different. But the underlying challenge was the same. How do you paint what you see? Not what you think you see, not what you have been taught to see, but what is actually there, in that moment, in that light, under that sky. It was a question he would spend his entire life answering. And even then, the answer would always be incomplete, always provisional, always in motion. But he was beginning. He was finding the tools, the techniques, the habits of attention that would allow him to pursue the questions seriously. He was learning to trust his own eye, to believe that what he saw mattered, even if it contradicted what others told him painting should be. During these years, Paris was full of young artists, all trying to find their way. Some would succeed. Many would not. The official art world was powerful and conservative. It rewarded certain kinds of work and ignored or rejected everything else. To paint differently was to risk everything. To risk poverty, rejection, obscurity. The Salon jury was strict. It favored work that followed established principles. Paintings that were carefully finished, smoothly blended, that told clear stories or depicted noble subjects. Paintings that looked like paintings were supposed to look, that confirmed what people already believed about art. Work that was rough, unfinished, that showed visible brushstrokes, that painted ordinary subjects in ordinary light, this work was often rejected. The jury did not understand it. They saw it as crude, as a failure to master the necessary skills, as a kind of laziness or incompetence. Monet and his friends knew this. They knew that painting the way they wanted to paint meant risking rejection by the Salon, meant struggling to sell their work, meant facing criticism from people who believed that what they were doing was not real art at all. But they also knew that they could not paint any other way. That to follow the official path would be to abandon what had drawn them to painting in the first place. The desire to respond to the world directly, to paint what moved them, what interested them, what they saw when they stood outside and looked. So they continued. They painted together. They shared ideas, materials, encouragement. They went to the countryside around Paris, to the forests and rivers, and set up their easels outdoors, working side by side, learning from each other, pushing each other to see more clearly, to work more boldly. These were years of formation, of trial and error, of small discoveries and frequent setbacks. They were not glamorous years. They were years of hard work, of uncertainty, of long hours spent alone with a canvas, trying to solve problems that often seemed unsolvable. But they were also years of possibility, of the sense that something new was emerging, that a different way of painting was taking shape, even if it was still unclear what that way was or where it would lead. Monet, during this time, was still the boy from Le Havre. He carried that place with him. The fog, the harbor, the changing light. The memory of standing on the beach with Boudin, learning to see the sky, learning that painting was about observation, about returning, about the willingness to look again, even when you thought you had already understood. He was also becoming something else. A painter. A serious painter. Someone committed to the work, to the long process of learning to see, learning to translate seeing into paint, learning to accept that the work would never be finished, that there would always be more to understand, more to discover, more to try. The caricatures were behind him now. The quick, clever drawings that had made him a local celebrity in Le Havre. He had moved beyond that. He was working on something slower, something more patient, something that required not cleverness, but endurance, not charm, but honesty. He was learning to paint light. Not light as an effect, not light as decoration, but light as the primary subject. Light as the thing that made everything else visible, that shaped form and color, that changed constantly, that could never be fully captured, but could be approached again and again with patience and attention and care. This would be the work of his life. It was beginning now, in these early years, in these studios and streets and riversides around Paris. It was beginning in the friendships with Renoir and Bazille and Sicily. It was beginning in the experiments with broken color and rapid brushwork, in the decision to paint outdoors, to respond directly to what they saw. But it had begun earlier, too. In Le Havre, on the beaches with Boudin, in the fog and the harbor light, in the restless boy who drew caricatures, but who was learning, slowly, to look at something other than faces, to look at the air, the water, the sky, to look at the way light moved through mist, to look at the ordinary world and find it inexhaustibly complex, endlessly changing, worth returning to over and over for the rest of a long life. The years passed slowly in this way. Each day brought its work. Each season brought its light. Monet painted and painted and painted. Sometimes the work went well. Sometimes it did not. Sometimes he felt he was making progress, understanding something new. Sometimes he felt he was going backward, losing what he thought he had learned. This was the nature of the work. It was not steady progress toward a clear goal. It was more like wandering, like exploring, like feeling your way through fog, finding paths and losing them, discovering something unexpected, and then not being able to finish. As this first chapter comes to a close, Monet is still very young. Nothing has been decided yet. There is no movement, no manifesto, no clear direction forward. There is only the quiet accumulation of experience. The coastal light of Le Havre, the fog that softened edges, the harbor that was never the same from one moment to the next, and the patient influence of learning to look, again and again. These early years did not produce masterpieces. They did not announce a future. They simply prepared him to notice. In the next episode, Monet will leave these beginnings behind. He will encounter resistance, tradition, and expectation, and begin to question the rules of painting he has been taught to follow. What happens next is not a break, but a gradual turning, a quiet shift from observation toward experimentation. If you'd like to continue this journey, Episode 2 will be waiting for you whenever you're ready. Until then, thank you for spending this time here. Rest well, and we'll continue the story soon.